Hi everybody and welcome to the Guardian Australia Book Club, Melbourne Writers Festival edition. I am Steph Harmon, I'm culture editor of Guardian Australia, and I'm so excited to introduce our guest Kate Grenville today and also to explain how this is all going to work. First up, I want to acknowledge that we are all on Indigenous land. I'm in my home on the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and I know you'll join me in paying respects to Indigenous elders, past, present and emerging, and recognising that this land was never ceded. First up, I just wanted to run through a few ground rules for those who haven't been at one of these excellent Zoom discussions before, which are hosted by our friends at Australia at Home. They are interactive chats. Don't worry, you're all muted for now, but if you turn your screen to gallery mode on the top right corner and turn your cameras on, you'll be able to get a sense of how many people have joined today's event. It's more than we've ever had before, so welcome. Second, if you open the chat on the bottom of the screen, you can type with everyone at the same time. Introduce yourselves, talk about what's going on in the discussion, keep the chat nice and inclusive. But most importantly, this is where you get the opportunity to ask a question or put forward a comment for discussion. We're going to be watching the chat, and if we see a question or comment that we like, one of our organisers is going to message you, asking if you'd like to ask it yourself on camera. Finally, we are live streaming this and we are recording for a video that's going to run on The Guardian, so please keep it nice. This is our third edition of Guardian Australia's Book Club, which is an event we launched in lockdown, mostly because we were missing books events so much. It's also great because it gives our favourite authors a chance to speak directly with their readers in lockdown, and we are so excited to be joined today by our guest, Kate Grenville. Kate is, of course, a luminary of Australian literature. As Michael Williams wrote in The Guardian recently, she's made telling stories about history her literary niche, with books like Joan Makes History, Dark Places, and her 2006 masterpiece, The Secret River. Her new book, A Room Made of Leaves, continues in this tradition, reimagining the life of Elizabeth MacArthur, who's the wife of Australian colonist John MacArthur, and tells that story through an old tin box of her memoirs that we're told have been discovered, but have really been invented by the author. It's a dance between history and fiction, between facts and storytelling, and it's a fascinating jumping off point for what I'm sure will be a great discussion. So this discussion is being hosted, of course, by the wonderful Michael Williams, and I'll throw to them now. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone, and how excited I am to be here today with our guest, Kate Grenville. She is a national treasure, one of our finest authors, and that was a wonderful introduction from Steph. A big thank you also to Melbourne Writers Festival, who this event's happening in partnership with. Some of you may have had the chance to see Kate's extraordinary keynote address for that festival over the past week. It's a really terrific and characteristically insightful meditation on questions of truth and fiction and history, many of which I think we'll delve into today, but it's so nice to be here. A Room Made of Leaves is Kate's 9th novel. It's 10 years since her last novel. It's a novel 20 years and some 30-something drafts in the making. So it's there's been a bit of build-up to this. Kate, thank you so much for joining us today.
Michael, it's absolutely wonderful to be with you and with everybody else. And look, I would just like to acknowledge that I'm on land of the Wurundjeri Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present. You know, stories have been told on this land for probably 60,000 years, and I'm honoured to be part of that tradition.
In no small part, A Room Made of Leaves reflects on what happens when we erase those stories and when we place other stories on top of them. And the ways in which I mentioned in my introduction that this was a novel 20 years in the making. You first had the idea for a book about Elizabeth MacArthur when you were researching The Secret River, is that right?
That's right. I was doing some deep background in stuff about the First Fleet, and I came across some letters by Elizabeth MacArthur, who came out 2 years after the First Fleet, with her husband, John MacArthur, who I'd been taught was the father of the Australian wool industry. Can there be a more boring thing to be remembered for? Anyway, I came across her letters, and they are extremely boring and extremely bland, except that just once or twice there is a phrase where a real person blazes through. In fact, not just a real person, but a sexual being as well. And it gave me the idea that those bland and boring letters were in fact a mask behind which the real Elizabeth MacArthur lived a very much more interesting life. And it's taken me 20 years to work out how to get around the different sort of factors in that story, how to tell all of those stories simultaneously, the truth and the fiction. But it's been a fabulous journey. I really miss writing it, actually. I wake up in the morning and thinking, oh, yes, I've got another project, but I mourn Elizabeth MacArthur.
I can see why. I missed reading it as soon as I was done. I want to get to those particular moments in the archive that suggested to you that there was more to Elizabeth MacArthur than the historical record would have. But before we get there, I'm just curious about the extent to which you think that historical silence, the ways in which certain historical figures present to us as bland or boring or lacking in an inner life, how gendered that is as a phenomenon.
Thank you so much. What a good question. Enormously is the answer in one word. When I was researching this, my publisher actually recommended that I go and read Boswell's London Diary, I think it's called. Boswell, a young man at loose in London, and it's basically all about getting drunk and having sex with prostitutes. It is a free and frank exposure of someone's inner life as well as the events. Now, for an 18th century woman, there was no way that anything, I mean, she couldn't do any of those things, but even if she thought them, she could not write them down. Letters, as we know, were very public things in late 18th century. They were more like the newspapers. They were to be read aloud in the parlour. And the novels of the time, well, women did write novels, but they only got to be published if they ticked enough boxes of the, women are supposed to be sedate helpmeets to males. So history, there are many, many, many voices that are left out of history. And one of them is women's. And in a way, the saddest thing is that they're not just completely silenced. Their true existences, their true sensibility has been obscured by the fact that some of them did leave a record. And it is, in my mind, perhaps not false, but certainly very partial.
Part of it seems to me, and this runs through all your work, but in particular, the last 4 novels of historical fiction, for lack of a less deadening genre to lie over it. I think they're richer and more complex than that. But is the divide between the public and the private, and that the public sphere is the domain of history and perhaps the private sphere is the domain of fiction? Do you think that's a reasonable?
Probably, yes. Although the private can be just as fictional as the public, as many people know. In fact, probably all of us know that. So really, maybe to make that opposition between fact and fiction, truth and the imagined, maybe that in itself is the falsity, even looking for any kind of distinction like that. And I suppose that's really where this book has its heart, in saying those kinds of, looking for those kind of simple oppositions is the problem. Whatever you're presented with, whether it looks like fact or looks like fiction, it can be cracked apart into a much more complicated and interesting thing, so that within every fiction, I mean, this is after all what Freud discovered, the jokes that we make are not just accidental. They may look like fictions, but actually they are, to the right sensibility, revealing all sorts of facts about us. And of course, facts, as we know, can be cracked apart into millions of fictions. So that's, I think, it's not only what I'm interested in with this book, but I realise, looking back, you mentioned Joan Makes History. I can see that without really being aware of it, it's been the thing I've always been interested in, subjectivity and where the boundaries of all that might lie.
Not just Joan Makes History, but if we take, for example, the relationship between Lillian's story and Dark Places, you've made your business taking a story, seeing how it might be told, and then getting in under the hood, if you like, and playing around to see what that subjectivity has given us.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I told Lillian's story, which was my first novel. Gosh, that's going back a long way. And it's the story of a woman who is sexually abused by her father. And after I'd finished it, I thought, well, that's fine, but actually, let's crack it open one more time. Let's tell the story of the father. What did he think he was doing? And that's, yes, you're quite right. That gave me enormous pleasure to get in there, and so that the story can't be either the victim story with Lillian or the heroic survivor story with Lillian. It's far more complicated than that. And her father is, you know, not a simple monster. He's also far more complicated. So yeah, you're right. It's yeah, no wonder I could never pass exams. The simple answer has never has never appealed.
I think that suggests a problem with the exams rather than with the student. But it's interesting to me because then, of course, you come to a work like The Secret River and the ways in which you've made Australian First Contact and colonial Australia the kind of focal point. And that question of heroes and villains plays out in see, that's what I like from an author. It looked to me like you're being served a martini at that moment, which I think is utterly appropriate. I hope you were.
If only.
But when it's the overlay of the building of a nation and the telling of a national story, that tendency towards heroes and villains and triumphalism plays out in a very different way, I think. Can you talk about your decision in A Room Made of Leaves to make that complexity around truth and fiction text rather than subtext? Because it's something you've clearly been interested in for a while, but in this novel, you make play around the truth and the nature of truth. You put it front and center right from the outset.
I put it front and center, but yes, but it is a dance, not just a pas de deux, but a pas de about half a dozen. It's a whole corps de ballet on stage playing around with the idea of truth and fiction. So whereas in, for example, Lillian's Story versus Dark Places, it was just the two aspects. In this, I think I'm questioning the whole idea of trying to categorize anything like that. It gave me huge pleasure. I mean, the book is, as I have said elsewhere, like a set of nested Russian dolls. And at the very heart of it is fact, real quotes from the real letters of the real person, whoever she actually was, Elizabeth MacArthur, which I've then put a kind of crust of interpretation around, which strike me as very plausible, if not factual. Then another layer of fiction, another layer of fact, etc. So I think I've, you know, the whole idea of questioning stories has cracked open for me. I don't know where I would go next with this. I suspect this might be my last book. So I think cracking it open to release the dozens of little dances in there might be perhaps as far as you can go with this idea.
So you open this book, and I'm assuming because this is a book club, I'm sure that our audience have all very diligently read the book and not just drunk red wine and shown up regardless. But for the handful who might not have, the opening conceit of the book is that you're not acting as an author at all. You're acting as an editor who is putting together a historical record that has landed in your lap.
Yeah.
How early did you know you wanted to use that framing device?
Look, the book took me 20 years to write because it took me that long to discover that framing device. So in the year 2000, when I was researching The Secret River and I discovered this, I knew what I wanted to do, had no idea how to do it. And of course, I haven't been twiddling my thumbs in that 20 years. I have written 6 other books. And I suppose you learn something from each book you write, although I think I'm too close to it to see just what I might have learned. But at some point, actually, it was shortly after I moved to Melbourne. So maybe that was the kind of opening of the door, that I realised that the way to tell the story I wanted to tell was to write a fake memoir of a real person. So already in the setup, you've got a way of, first of all, framing it so that it is clearly false, but at the same time, it's factual because it's based on a real person and her real letters. And as you say, the introduction is dripping with irony, a little sort of editor's note in which I say, how astonishing, I found somehow by magic these old long lost papers in the roof of an old house. And what do you know? They turned out to be the secret, long lost, somewhat scandalous memoirs of Elizabeth MacArthur, where instead of writing her bland and boring letters, she has poured out her heart in, kind of explosive little pellets of memory. How fabulous that it was me, but of course nothing to do with me. I just transcribed and edited it. So that was huge. It allowed me to do all the layering of truth and fiction that I wanted to do. And it had taken me, 17 years and a move to Melbourne to discover it.
That seems like drastic measures. And obviously at this point in time, we wouldn't recommend it to other writers, but
yes, had I known, I might have gone to Queensland instead.
Now, but before I continue with my questions, I should note that in the chat section of this conversation where people are posting their questions, there has been a cavalcade of anxiety about your throwaway statement that you think this is your last book.
Oh.
And people won't let me go any further, I think, until you put their minds at rest. What makes you feel like that could be the case?
Look, in a way, my agent would tell you, and my publisher, that I say this with every book. And it hasn't been true up till now, but of course one of these days it will be. Look, the fact is I am working on another project. In fact, I have 2 projects. In fact, really, I have 3 projects. So it was a throwaway line. And I suppose what it reflects is that I feel, what does it reflect? Well, I'm feeling a bit old. This whole COVID lockdown, all that business does make a person present with their mortality. But also perhaps it means that I'm satisfied with that book. I feel that finally, at last, after 9 books, perhaps I have finally come closer than I ever have before to saying the deep thing that I want to say about, not just about stories and fiction, but somehow about life, that it has to be constantly cracked open. Complacency is the killer in every respect. So look, yes, it was a throwaway line. Don't hold me to it.
That's good. Everyone seems rapidly reassured. 3 projects seems like enough to be going on with. I'm basically spending my time trying to work out what I'm having for dinner tonight. So 3 projects. So, Kate, I want to dig in a little deeper to the MacArthurs and to your historical heartthrob, William Dawes.
Mm-hmm.
But before I get to those 3, I'm interested in, I think more so even than the Lieutenant or Sarah Thornhill, this novel feels like a matched pair with The Secret River in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
Not least, and I don't want to spoil anything about the book, but there is a note towards the end of the novel of melancholy belonging in Australia, but an understanding of the cost of that belonging. That Elizabeth MacArthur, your Elizabeth MacArthur, like William Thornhill before her, has a palpable sense that she's at home, but also understands the great cost of that sense. And I'm curious to know how much that. I'm curious to know the relationship between this book and The Secret River in your mind.
Yes, it's a very good question. Look, at the end of The Secret River, William Thornhill, who has attained his land, taken it by force from the Darug people, he sits on his balcony looking out with great melancholy at a landscape that he thinks is empty. In fact, it probably wasn't, but he thinks it's empty and he doesn't quite know what to do with that feeling. He's got what he wants, that is a home in Australia, which he loves. But at the same time, something is gnawing away at him and he doesn't quite know what it is. So he sits there and stares out at the bush, not a happy man. So what happens at the end of A Room Made of Leaves, of course, is that Elizabeth MacArthur, who is also an English person, born in Devon of farming, her father was a farmer. Over the years, she too has come to realise that Australia is now her home. It's the place she loves. It's the place when she dies, she wants her dust to become part of this place not the place where her ancestors are from. And she takes it one step further than Thornhill, partly because she's been educated in a little bit of knowledge about the Indigenous people that she's been displaced, unlike Thornhill, who didn't know very much. So she's prepared to say, I am here, this is my home, I'm not going anywhere, but I recognise that it is not mine. I love this place, but I've stolen it. And she's left with the question that I think possibly we white Australians are left with today, which is, what do we do once we've been prepared to actually look in the face what we did, that is steal the land? What do we do next? Now, Elizabeth MacArthur doesn't quite know. She says, I'm prepared to look it in the eye and admit what I've done. And she says, I know that that doesn't take away any of the sorrow and grief of it, but it's a first step without which you can't do anything else. And, you know, you mentioned the phrase historical novel. I always resist that phrase, as I think you know. Historical novels have a kind of musty, dusty, over-researched feeling to my eye. I don't actually enjoy reading them. I think that I write books about the present that just happen to be set in the past, because to look at the past is a fabulous way of getting into the present, partly because it gets under the guard of readers who might resist things that you want to say if it was about today. It's a kind of a Trojan horse, the historical setting. So when Elizabeth MacArthur sits at the end of the book in her room of leaves and has that mournful revelation, really, to my mind, she's expressing, well, certainly what I feel as a white Australian.
It's interesting to hear you talk about the historical components of the book as a kind of Trojan horse, because the kind of counterpoint to that is the care you take in historical verisimilitude, if you like. I remember very fondly the slush lamps of the Secret River, and the care that you went to make sure you got that detail correct. And it seems to me that each of these 4 colonial novels have embedded in them deep respect for the work of historians, and not a desire to try and replicate that work, but a desire to make sure that that work is integrated into what you're doing. How important is that to you? If it's just a Trojan horse, why are you so keen to get that just right?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know, I think might be the short answer, but I know that I feel very passionately that I'm not going to knowingly distort or falsify what I know to be historical facts, which is very different from saying that the book is history. That's an argument that I've had many times before, and hopefully the world has moved on from that argument. By which I mean, to me, it's much more interesting to say, this is something that really happened, and yet it doesn't quite make sense. Now, if you're making something up out of whole cloth, an invention, the only thing that you can fall back on are kind of cliches and stereotypes and, you know, things that happened and so on. Whereas when you're actually coming to grips with the fact that the historical record is full of fascinating contradictions, things that don't add up, then you are forced to another stage of imagination, because you have to say, okay, I can't evade this. For example, in A Room Made of Leaves, there is no question that John MacArthur was an extremely unpleasant man. And from the record, it is fairly clear that he was unpleasant even as a very young man. And yet, Elizabeth MacArthur, who, in spite of her letters being boring, a very nice character does come through them. She's actually a very engaging personality. So the big question is, why did they marry? Now, there are 2 kind of facts which don't quite add up. And it leads you then to think, well, okay, I can't deny these. I can't walk around them. I can't invent another thing. I can't make him an angel because he wasn't. So let's find a way, as happens in life, of explaining the things that we simply don't understand about ourselves and our neighbours. So, you know, I was a student of history. It was an important part of my education, learning about history. And interestingly, the history lesson that I most remember, if I may take a moment to tell you this story. In high school, I had a fabulous history teacher. Thank you, Mrs. Towers. We were learning about the rise of Nazi Germany. And instead of giving us a textbook where we would kind of learn things, she gave us photocopied sheets of about half a dozen extracts from translated newspapers, German newspapers from about 1936. And she said, right, I want you all to look through these and work out from them what you think might have been happening, with all the biases inherent in each of those things. And I remember being very cranky because I wanted to just be told what happened. But of course, what she was doing was teaching in the most sophisticated way, true, honest historical method. Yes, so as you can tell by the length of that answer, this is something of a passion. You know, Michael Ondaatje says that every novelist is at heart secretly wanted to be an archaeologist. And I think he could probably say historian as well. And I think he's right about that.
I might ask you now to expand on something we touched upon before, which is the glimpses in the historical record of a richer, deeper Elizabeth MacArthur, and in particular her blush.
Okay. The blush. In those letters that I read back in the year 2000, in among the wastes of dullness and correctness, there were just 5 words that told me that there was a book there. Isn't that amazing? 5 words really gave rise to this book. She'd asked for some lessons in astronomy from William Dawes, who was the astronomer who came with the first fleet. And he gave them to her, but you know, astronomy is pretty hard stuff. And she writes to a friend, I had the lessons from Mr. Dawes, but I mistook my abilities and I blush at my error. Now, that word blush, in the context of her otherwise bloodless, very impersonal letters, leapt off the page like a flame. It was a blaze of eroticism, basically. I mean, when do we blush? We blush when we're kind of emotionally and perhaps sexually engaged with something. That's when we blush. So she was revealing, I suppose without intending to, something more than just, you know, the humiliation of not understanding about astronomy. I thought, aha, she has the hots for William Dawes. As simple as that. And that was also the moment, actually, at which the book called The Lieutenant, which is a book based on William Dawes, also had its beginning, because it told me something about, it suddenly cracked apart that sort of dry as dust notion of all these people coming and doing the settling and so forth and so on. They were real human beings and there were sexual relationships between them.
I was thrilled to see you return to William Dawes, because he's clearly a historical figure who sparks a lot of imaginative empathy in you, in The Lieutenant, and then again here. Why do you think he was such a singular figure?
Look, it's a good question. The thing is, I'm not the only person to have found William Dawes attractive, and I think I'm right in saying that all the people I'm thinking of are women. So, you know, there is something about William Dawes, even though, I mean, his own writings are pretty starchy. I mean, they're mostly about astronomy, except, of course, his language notebooks. He was one of the very few people in those early days who had enough respect for the Indigenous people around him, the Gadigal and Wangal people, to want to not just learn a list of vocabulary so that they could demand things, but to actually understand the inner life of the language, to learn its grammar so that he could have a proper conversation. And his notebooks, of course, record those conversations very, very often with a young woman called Pachigurang, who I think was about 12. It was not a sexual relationship, I don't think. And they seem to have had a very playful, mutually curious and mutually respectful relationship. And I think it might be that fascinates so many of us about William Dawes. Who was this man who was he was a soldier. He was part of the machinery of brutal military colonization of this country. And yet something in him, some spark burned that he could overcome all that and do all this other stuff. Yeah, it's funny, when I wrote The Lieutenant, in fact, I gave, in the first, I think, 12 or 15 drafts of The Lieutenant, Mrs. MacArthur was there as just a minor character who used to come, and she had the astronomy lessons, which is a matter of fact. She had the astronomy lessons, and it was very clear that she was very interested in Mr. Dawes, but Mr. Dawes, of course, was not interested in her because he had his little bit on the side, as most of the officers did, in the form of a woman called Mrs. Brown. So the wonderful thing is that when I wrote A Room Made of Leaves, I knew I could return to Dawes, but I also realised that I could find Mrs. Brown again and give her a little bit more of a story. So there is a fabulous, you know, a novel isn't a finished thing. It continues like life to just kind of spawn more and more things. I've forgotten what your question was in that. It was something about Dawes, but
it doesn't matter. The answer was better than the question, which is it's a good thing. I'm interested in the ways in which Dawes, part of what clearly makes Dawes such a kind of sympathetic figure was his curiosity and openness to a different understanding of the Australians who were here pre-settlement, and that's a kind of key thing that comes through. Is there part of you in writing these histories that's anxious about, you know, we talked about the absences and silences in stories that are gendered, but obviously in a colonial history, part of the act of genocide and displacement is at a level of story as well as at a far more literal level. And you have Elizabeth reflect on that very movingly at the end of the book. But I'm curious about, for you as a novelist, how did you feel about writing Aboriginal characters, finding ways to give voice to their story in a way that you felt like the right person to do it?
Yes, that's a good question. You know, I didn't finish an answer that you asked some time ago about the Secret River, about the Secret River had looked at the problem of white people displacing the original owners. What this book really talks about is not the displacement, but the stories about the displacement. So I have a long scene in this book where Elizabeth MacArthur is told a story by her husband about a particular event concerning an Aboriginal attack on Parramatta. And she doesn't believe it. And she realises that the greatest, almost a greater wrong to do to any set of people is to remove their stories, to silence their stories. Not even just to silence their stories, because that leaves a gap in the record, to replace one story with another. So it's now unknown that there was ever a story there. Sorry, just remind me where your question...
You have the wonderful line, not just the turning off from their lands and the damage to their old ways, not just the cruelties inflicted, not just the deaths. Behind all that is another fundamental violence, the replacement of the true history by a false one, which I think is as powerful an account of, you know, the cost of dispossession as I remember reading.
Yes, thank you. That really is the heart of the book. That sentence is somebody said every book, every novel is written to conceal a sentence within it. And I think that is the one that I groped for 20 years to get to. But your question, I now remember, was about how I felt that I had the right to write about and put in Aboriginal characters and give them dialogue, which I had not done in The Secret River. I had in many early drafts of The Secret River, but by the time the book was published, I realised that there was no way that I could feel comfortable. I hadn't found a way of feeling comfortable about it that wasn't patronising, appropriating, all the many things that a non-Indigenous person can do, the crimes that you can commit, really, to, you know, we not only stole their land, now we're going to steal their stories and steal their kind of appropriate their sensibilities. So I wasn't going to do that in The Secret River. But in this book, there were a few moments where I felt that I could, and it really came out of what William Dawes did, because in The Lieutenant, of course, in his in his notebooks, he wrote down entire conversations between him and his language informants. And they were the conversations that I could use verbatim in The Lieutenant, knowing that I felt that that was okay. He had written them down, he'd heard them and written them down. I could then, as long as I didn't change them, use them verbatim. And I did, of course, talk to the Alan Madden at the Metropolitan Land Council about that. And he said, yes, let them know we had a language. So with this book, I felt emboldened to go a little further. And also I thought, I can't tell the story I want to tell without taking this risk. So I drew then on my very slight knowledge of Indigenous, particularly Indigenous women. I have had the privilege of going to a few remote Aboriginal communities, just a couple for a very short time, but my overwhelming feeling there was that the women in particular were not only extremely shrewd, but were laughing at me and the other white people a great deal of the time because of our clumsiness and ignorance and general kind of hopelessness. So I felt that that little tiny ghost of experience could carry me through writing what I just felt that I had to give those people, the Aboriginal women who came to talk to Dawes, a real living presence in the book.
I think you do so. You do so beautifully. I mean, it's part of what makes conversations about artificial lines between fact and fiction seem so unnecessary and so reductive. I think is that the power of this book, leaving aside the fact that it is an absolutely wonderful and pleasurable read, but the power of this book is that thing of its humanity and its imaginative empathy, and that's not strictly a historical exercise, and so it seems kind of neither here nor there whether it's the historical record or not.
Yes, you're absolutely right about that. I think it's my own personal kind of hang-up that I feel I want to, and also because, as I think I said, nothing that you can invent is as interesting as the things that actually really happened. They're always more interesting and they always lead you to more interesting things. But yes, I think every writer has to come to their own sort of place of comfort, writing about history, writing about people who are not themselves, you know, the danger of appropriating and blundering into something where you don't know enough about it to write about it. We all have to find a different spot there. And that's fine, because no reader is ever obliged to read a book. If you don't like it, as I quite often find myself doing, you can fling it across the room. Sorry?
Are you a flinger? Do you fling them?
Oh, I do. I do fling. Yes, I do fling.
What's the heaviest? No, I won't ask that. You can't name names. It's
I could name names, but perhaps I won't.
We have a question from Marg Darcy Hannah. Marg, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, Michael. My question was about really what you've been talking about, which is, isn't fact and fiction always dependent on the writer's perspective? And aren't we all very good at reinventing our own history in a way that suits us?
That is so true. What a good question. And what a beautiful room made of leaves you appear to be in there.
Absolutely.
Look, absolutely. It's why there's never one history of anything, you know, the history of something or other. There can only be a history of something. And the more histories, the better, because none of them will be truthful. Even all of them together probably won't be truthful, but all of them simply open up something which is a bit like science. It's just a question that has to go on being asked. And every new generation has to ask it in their own way. And every new generation also opens up histories that were never thought to be asked before. I mean, until in my childhood, to ask for the Indigenous history of Australia to be told was kind of unthinkable. And now people are, you know, telling the history of animals and so on. So it's like, how fabulous, like life itself, it just grows and grows.
Your overwhelming interest in the present and your use of the past as a Trojan horse to tell that story means that there is a risk that there will be readings of your books that politicize them. You know, that you make the point, and your fictional Elizabeth MacArthur makes the point that accounts of national accounts of truth and things are self-serving in different ways, and if you're inviting readers to understand their present through your depiction of the past, then you're buying into what is sometimes a very contested debate in Australia. Do you think about those political outcomes when you write a book? Are you wary of them?
I try not to think of them, because I think the phrase is conflict averse, and having run into some conflict on political grounds with the Secret River, historians who felt that I had no right to be, writing about history, I am very wary of it. And in fact, I find it very inhibiting to write anything, actually, let alone good fiction. So I try very hard not to think about that. But as an engaged citizen of the world and of this country, those thoughts are why I write, really. I mean, I'm not interested in writing, just some kind of bit of entertainment, some bit of fluff. I actually want to write a book of ideas, and those ideas are inflected by who I am and where I am. In my younger days, people often used to say, do you describe yourself as a feminist writer? And of course the answer was yes, but it was more complicated than that. I'm a woman, and I'm a feminist. So whatever I write, whether I kind of intend it as a feminist tract or not, it's going to spring out of a person who is a feminist. So those thoughts are what makes me write, but at the same time, I have to do a kind of sleight of hand not to think about them too much when I'm writing, or I would be completely paralyzed.
I think the real political power of it in an Australian context, and you make this point in the novel, is the importance of truth to any reconciliation process. That elsewhere in the world, truth and reconciliation are paired concepts. You see that in Northern Ireland, you see that in South Africa, whereas in Australia, when the Howard government was particularly fond of banding around the word reconciliation, it felt untethered from truth. Mm-hmm. And so, that brings us back then again to those questions of truth and authenticity at the heart of this novel. And I think truth shouldn't be politicized, but it is.
Yes, that's right. And we can maybe never find the truth, but we have to not be cowardly in going looking for it. Of course, this whole business, from the Secret River onwards, began for me with the so-called walk for reconciliation across the Harbour Bridge. And that happened to end at the point where my convict ancestor would have been offloaded from the convict ship. And that made me realise that this idea of reconciliation was an easy, like the bridge that I had just walked across that body of water, Sydney Harbour, the idea of reconciliation is not as easy as making a leap from A to B. It should be difficult. It should be a long, painful process. And researching for the Secret River, I almost went straight from that march up to the State Library of New South Wales, just up the hill, to try to find out what had happened when my ancestor stepped off the ship and took up land, as the euphemism goes, on the Hawkesbury River. So that was my personal journey through that. Perhaps that never ends, because the problem is not, it's the situation of a shared history and a shared country, particularly where sovereignty was never ceded, is that, how do you put it right? You probably can't put it right, but you can go on within the honourable field of sort of force field of having at least told the story truthfully, acknowledged honestly what happened. That would seem to me the sine qua non of whatever comes next.
We have a question, but I won't throw to that relates to that, but I won't throw to that questioner just yet, because I'm not clear whether there's somewhere where they can talk to us directly. So before we go there, we have a question from Janine. Janine, are you there?
Yes, hi.
Hi, Janine.
Yes. My home is actually on MacArthur land at Camden, and the Camden Park is just, 100 metres from me. So when you were doing your research, was there anything about Elizabeth being at Camden? Because there's so much of her around here with the park and the churches and things.
Yes, look, my book ends in 1801, by which time the MacArthurs had not yet gone to the land that's now called Camden. So I didn't have to go there, but of course in my research I did find out a bit about that. Yes, I mean MacArthur now there is a whole story for somebody to explore about just how MacArthur, when he went to England, persuaded the powers that be there to give him 10,000 acres of the best land in the colony, that is the land at Camden, which governors before him had specifically said, this land must never be granted away. It must always remain the property of the Crown. Now, I would love, maybe a historian has found what lever John MacArthur, who was a great puller of secret strings, what lever he found to impel Lord Camden to give him that land. So, and I haven't been to Camden, the Camden estate. It's only opened once a year and it just never kind of worked. And I was quite pleased to be able to end my book in 1801, where the MacArthurs, of course, were still at Parramatta at Elizabeth Farm, which is still there, as you would probably know, as a beautiful historic house. So you can actually sit on the veranda in a chair that's probably very like the one Elizabeth MacArthur would have sat. You can and look out over her garden. There's a fabulous sense of the past suddenly being very much alive there. So you probably feel it in Camden too. It's lovely to see that now things are being called after Elizabeth MacArthur rather than John MacArthur.
I tell you what, after reading this book, John MacArthur comes across as such a royal shit that, I think they'll be stripping his name off things now.
I think they might have already. I mean, he was on the $2 note, of course, when we used to have those things. But yes, I suppose there are statues of him. It'd be nice to see some of those statues toppled. But, I'm not the first person to say that actually, if any one individual was the parent of the Australian wool industry, it was certainly Elizabeth MacArthur, not John. I'm not the first person to say that. Look, he was a royal shit, but what I've tried to do in the book is actually to do something more interesting than just describe someone as a royal shit. I have tried to say perhaps some of the things that made him such a shitty person. Shitty people are made, I think, not born. I don't think I believe in original sin. So I have tried to make him, a fairly rounded, interesting, unhappy, but sympathy-worthy character.
I think you succeeded that, but still, royal shit of the third. To return for a moment to the kind of question of politicised arguments around the telling of these stories, we have a question from Jessica McHenry.
Hi, Kate. Sorry, I'm not in a position to show you my video. Hopefully you can hear me though.
Yes, I can.
Oh, good. Excellent. My question is whether or not you have any advice for younger Australian writers who are desperately trying to tell Australian stories that feel true, but also don't wish to blunder insensitively into politicised arguments. Like, where's the legacy going? How do we balance that sense of responsibility without feeling inhibited, as you said, by potentially politicising our work?
Yes, that's a very good question to which I don't have much of an answer. I think the first thing would be to say that you should write in the first place without thinking about any of that. Because if you're writing, if you've already put yourself in the kind of, blinkers of being too careful, then what you write will probably not have much life and energy. It may not find a readership. And the bottom line with a piece of writing is that whatever you're trying to do in it, you want someone to read it. So I would say that the first thing would be to write the first however many drafts uninhibitedly, as if no one is going to read it but yourself. But then to sit down And Stephen King says this. He says you should write the first draft with the door closed, meaning keep the world out, and only after, you know, the first few drafts, then open the door and invite the world in. And that seems to me fabulous advice. And if Stephen King says it, I think it must be true. So at a certain point where you feel you've written the thing for yourself, to then think very seriously, having done all the homework you can about whatever event it is that you're describing, as much homework about the politics. I mean, it's the least, it's the beginning of respect to educate oneself as much as possible. And then to reach out and, if you can, find the, you know, appropriate people to make sure that in your own cultural blindness, by which I mean my own cultural blindness, you haven't blundered into something all unawares. So with The Secret River, and in fact with all these books, I have approached Aboriginal groups and not ask them to kind of give a stamp of approval or anything like that, but as a mark of respect to say, look, here is the book, here it is, over to you, you know. And I think perhaps that's, well, look, it's what I've done. So it's tricky, but the fact that you're aware of it is probably, the battle is halfway beaten. The other thing is, of course, that we are living in a fabulous time when non-Indigenous writers are now telling those stories, in many cases actually paralleling the ones we're told. For example, you know, The Secret River is about my great-great-great-grandfather Solomon Wiseman on the Hawkesbury River. Well, a Darug, which was Darugland, is Darugland, a Darug woman has just written a book, Julia Jansen has just written a book in which Solomon Wiseman appears as a minor character. So this is fabulous. It's like, you know, we no longer, it's not up to us to tell those stories. They are being told by the people they truly belong to.
James Vickers has a question that follows on from where Jessica was asking more about younger Australian writers. James has a question about younger readers for you, James.
Hi there, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Kate. We've met before once or twice, but the question I have following on from you've grasped history in a way, and the stories of history that you've talked about. But I think one of the things I'd love to see is a way of reaching younger readers. Do you have you ever thought about writing young adult fiction in a way that to kind of reach out with some of these stories, some of these ideas to young people in a way that's more direct than asking them perhaps to read at a more adult level?
Well, look, I have thought about it and I have even tried, but I can't do it. I have certain things that I can do as a writer and certain things that I can't. So I'll have to leave that to somebody else. But I also do feel, and I'm probably going to step on some toes here, I wonder about the whole category of thing called young adult fiction. I think perhaps we underestimate a lot of young people's, I mean, I'm not talking about children here, I'm talking about young adult, which is, I guess, teenagers, isn't it? Underestimate the ability of those young people to engage with what we think of as adult fiction. Look, I can only draw on my own experience, which is that there was no such thing as young adult fiction when I was a child. So you moved straight from Swallows and Amazons, basically, and Biggles. You went straight to, in my case, what was on my parents' bookshelves, things like The Tree of Man, for example, or Riders in the Chariot, I remember. Now, I only understood about half of Riders in the Chariot, probably much less, actually, but that didn't matter. It left an indelible, powerful impression on me. I didn't have to understand everything about it to realise that there was a huge world there, both of beautiful language, but also puzzling, interesting, complicated ideas that I knew that I would gradually begin to understand more. So I probably shouldn't have said this because I know there are many fabulous young adult books. In fact, I'm just thinking of some even as I say that. But the fact that I read that, I mean, John Marston is the one that leaps to mind. I love reading his books too. So does that make them young adult fiction, or does it just make them good fiction?
Look, Kate, you've equally expressed skepticism about historical fiction, so maybe you're just not a fan of genre pigeonholes.
That's absolutely true. Yes, you're right.
The fluidity. We had a question in the chat from Christina Hoffman, who wanted to know, with books in the works over years and projects running simultaneously, what does your daily routine look like, Kate, if you cultivate?
Daily routine. Well, you know, I have 2 children, and very much a large part of my writing life, they were young children at school. So I developed a routine that is very helpful, which is that, you know, my writing day started when I'd taken them to school, and it ended when I had to pick them up. And that was a very good, even after that no longer became necessary, I wasn't still waiting for them at the school gate when they were doing their HSC. It became a terrific thing because it meant that you didn't wait for inspiration. You just sat down at 9 o'clock, and in a way it was a job of work. So my daily routine is still that. I get up, and by 9 o'clock, often still in my pajamas, certainly in lockdown, I'm already sitting down and working, and I end at about 3 o'clock, and I then go and do kind of busy work for the rest of the day. Research is always fun. And before the great COVID struck, one of the best bits of writing was hopping in the car and just going somewhere without any very clear idea of what I wanted, just mooching around a place where something had happened, taking photographs, of course, but also sketching. I can't sketch for nuts, but if you've sketched a place, if you've sat down for half an hour with a pencil and paper, you have a relationship to that place that is like no other relationship I know. And you can then draw on that to write about it. Does that answer the question? I write, my first drafts are usually written by hand, which makes me a bit of a dinosaur, but I love writing by hand because not only is it slow, and my mind doesn't work particularly quickly, my imagination takes a while. So the slowness of handwriting suits me. But the other wonderful thing about handwriting is it's very private. There is no question that a handwritten document is for your own eyes. And to me, that's the only way really to write stuff with truth and energy is to be writing it without second guessing what people are going to think when they read it, at least in the first draft or 2.
That's very Elizabeth MacArthur of you. I think that's a good thing. Now, we're going to have to let you go in a minute, but given that this event is not just part of the Guardian Australia Book Club, but it's also a Melbourne Writers Festival event, and there's lots of wonderful other sessions they have that I encourage people to go and find out about over the next few days. But I thought we should end on a book recommendation from you, things that you have read and loved lately. Do you have a hot tip?
Okay, well, yes, lots of them in this time of lockdown. But look, not long ago, a young woman writer called Bree Lee interviewed me for one of these kinds of things, a Zoom event. And so I went and read her book, which is called Eggshell Skull, which I thought was fabulous. So good that I then went and got her second book, which is called Beauty, which is equally fantastic. So I don't know whether she's having anything to do with the MWF, but it blew me away. A younger generation, she's probably the age of my daughter, with such honesty, vigorous courage of thinking, and she's also a terrific writer. So that's my hot tip.
That is an excellent tip. It's been wonderful to speak to you today, Kate. Thank you to everyone in the chats who contributed such wonderful questions and comments. And I'm going to throw back to Steph Harmon at The Guardian. But thanks, Kate.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you so much. That was such a pleasure. I kind of forgot that I had to close it. Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you, Michael. That was a wonderful discussion. And particularly thank you, everyone, for asking questions and putting such great comments and thoughts in the chat. We're going to be doing this again monthly, so stay tuned to Guardian Australia and Australia at Home to find out about our next session. Australia at Home, who hosted us today, is sponsored by Essential Media, Principal Co, the Centre for Australian Progress, the Community Council of Australia and Guardian Australia. They're hosting regular discussions. So next week, the schedule includes Paddy Manning talking about his new book, Body Count and the Human Toll of Climate Change. And next Friday's fortnightly tech talk as well. Big thank you to the Melbourne Writers Festival. There was a lot of love flowing to them in that chat as well. It's one of the, as somebody said, one of the positives of lockdown is this great festival continuing online. So thank you so much for hosting us. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye.